Hello again. Today I'm going to be focusing on the brakes, so that's the handbrake and the foot brake. There's all the parts laid out on the workbench here, so I'm going to start building it up shortly. Before I do that, I just want to take you through some of the parts. There are quite a few components in the rear brakes. The handbrake mechanism is separate to the foot brake. I've had all of the original handbrake parts replated. There are a few key new components. This is one of the original brake pistons that's gone rusty. It's of an old design and they're not known for their reliability. I've replaced them with these Fosway Performance pistons, so they mount in exactly the same way to the piston carrier. As you can see, it's been replated. And Fosway Performance is nothing to do with me. It's a company that happens to be based near the Fosway, but they make some excellent components to do with braking, cooling, and I think some electrical components. This is really nicely etched into there, so it's not proud of the surface, it's actually sunk in. Aluminium billet, the finish is excellent, so it's a 1.75 inch piston on the rear. Got a nice bung on the end of the bleed nipple, and you can see here it's just really smooth, the interface that goes onto the back of the brake pad. It's got a modern seal technology in here, and this is a far better and more reliable piece of kit to fit to the car so that the braking is reliable and consistent. I've also got new brake pads. Now, I've got two sets here, and I'd like to show you a comparison because one of them's going back due to poor quality. I bought a set of these because this other set wasn't in stock at the time. I think there's only a small amount of difference in the price, but the backing plate on the pad here is really badly riveted on. The rivets actually stand proud, and the backing plate also stands proud of the pad. So where you've got the rivet heads here, you'll get those as pressure points onto the piston, and that will actually be damaging it, and you won't get an even distribution of the force going through the pad. So those are really inferior quality parts. They're going to be sent back, and I'm going to be asking for a refund. I'm going to be questioning why they're on sale at all, because that's not suitable to fit to anyone's car. I look by comparison at a decent quality part by Girling here. The rivet heads are recessed into the backing plate, and the backing plate is suitably recessed into the pad. And that gives a nice smooth face on which the piston can press evenly so that you get a good pedal feel and a good response. Another part I bought for this car that isn't standard fit but is a really good modern upgrade is this remote bleeding kit. Because the car's got inboard brakes, bleeding them isn't at all easy. So what this does is connect up to the brakes and allow you to get much easier access to bleed nipples. The first job to do is to put the retaining plates for the brake pad and fit them to the piston carrier. So it's just a simple question of slotting those into the groove that's in the piston carrier. It's made a lot easier by the fact that this has been freshly replated. At least it should be. There we go. That slots down. And you want that to be completely flush because the piston mounts on top and it'll offset it a little bit if that's not all the way down. A little trick to getting them in if they're slightly too long is bend it slightly, and then when it's in, rebend it so that it's straight again, and then it'll spring into the groove. At this stage it'd be easy to bolt the piston straight on, but there's not enough space to get it through the frame. I now need to offer this piston carrier up to the disc and the bracket here. Reason being that you need to shim these to centralise it onto the disc, otherwise you'll get a different amount of pad either side of the disc. So this job's quite fiddly, you end up dropping shims all over the place. I'm going to put the replated bolt in with a new spring washer, push it all the way through, put the shim on, and then I'm going to do exactly the same for the bottom. So push that all the way through, get that shim on, and then put them most of the way back through again. And you've got to be quite careful because it's really easy to drop the shims all over the place. So starting at the top, careful, oh, there goes one. Right, so I've now got the top one in, and because the thread on the bracket that it's mounting to, the thread doesn't start straight away, you can push the bolt in and then start to engage the thread. All right, with that hand started, you have to put the bottom bolt in beforehand, because there's not enough space to get it in there otherwise. But I can now pivot it around the top, and because I've dropped this shim, I can now have another go at feeding that back in and get that to work. Okay, with that in about the right position, I'm going to use the screwdriver just to push the bolt in. That should hopefully be enough to stop the shim dropping out, and then I can tighten up the top and work on the bottom. These bolt heads are far too close to the differential casing to get a socket in there. So it's now the laborious task of getting in there and part turn by part turn, turning these bolt heads to get it all into place. After several minutes of fiddly bolt tightening, you can now see that the piston carrier is nicely centred on the brake disc. So what I'm looking for is a nice flat feel from the piston carrier here onto the face of the brake disc there, and obviously that's where the pads slide in either side. So with that done up now, it's time to lock wire the two together. So right here we have a good example of why these bolt heads have been drilled twice, because of course the hole could end up in the wrong position and not work for you. Okay, so that's a bit short, just need to extend that a little bit more. So with the lock wire in place here, I now need to get the piston in here. These three fixings will be easy. It's just this one down here will be a bit slow and a bit boring to do, but it is possible. I can now start to mount the pistons either side, so this one will slot in here. I don't think it particularly matters, but my preference is to have the Fosway Performance logo going the same way as the disc, so what I'll do is on the other side I'll have it going round that way. So what I'm going to do is put this little bolt in first, offer it up so at least it's in the right place, and then get some others in around it by hand. I get it in the right place. There we go. I'm trying to get to that bolt down there. There is space between the piston and the differential here to squeeze this spanner through and get it started. And then as the bolt sinks in, I'm then going to have to get underneath it and use this ring spanner to be able to get on the end of it. So, by comparison, this side should be a lot easier, so I'm just going to set that up, hopefully largely by hand, and I should be able to get a spanner onto each of these to do them up. I can now offer up the brake pads. Just getting a bit of copper grease on the back of the pad. And in that one goes. And the other side, that's that one too. And then we get the brake pad retainer, goes in there. It's a bit fiddly this actually, because the plate actually gets in the way of putting the bolt in, which is a bit annoying. Okay, there we go. Spring, washer and nut. I can now think about the brake pipes and how the fluid is going to get into the pistons. This is the original brake pipe with the flexi hose that I cut off, and this T-piece here splits off the hose into this caliper and onto the other side. But at this point I've also offered up the remote bleeding kit. On this side it'll go into the bottom of this piston, out the top, into the bottom of this piston, and then out the top of this one, and that's where it'll go off to the remote bleed in this case. So for this side I've made a bridging pipe to go from one side to the other. I need to make a new one of these to send the fluid to this side, and then I need to make a bridging pipe for this side as well. To make the brake pipes, I've got this Draper pipe flaring kit. I bought a roll of copper nickel, or cunifer as it's sometimes known, 3/16 brake pipe. If you actually look at the brake pipe close up, it really is very thin stuff and only a tiny little bore, so that's what's making your brakes work. The good thing about this copper nickel pipe is that it's quite malleable, so that allows you to make a flare in it. This is one of the original bridging pipes that I've straightened out so that I can use this as a reference for the new pipe so that I can cut it to length. Very simple pipe cutting tool. Now it's really vital to have where you're clamping it in the process here to flare the ends to get a good joint, to have it as square as possible. So you really don't want any bends on that, so I'm going to have to straighten that out a little bit first. The next stage of the process is to fit this swaging die. So this little shaft needs to go inside the brake pipe. Now, tools that I use to help make this life easier for me, I've actually got this old broken dart. Sometimes when you cut the pipe off, you can't quite get the die inside there. So I use the dart to basically just roll around in there to open up the hole slightly so that you can get this in. Then I've got this big file here for just filing the whole lot so that it's really nice and square. because if the swaging die isn't in completely perpendicular to the pipe, then you'll end up with a flare that's going off to one side. Right, so with that in place, I can now use this clamp here. So it's got 5 different gauges of pipe. This is the smallest 3/16 pipe. So you clamp the brake pipe into place with about the pipe thickness protruding from the top. So you can see it's serrated inside here, and that really grips the pipe. So I'll flip this over, clamp it down into place. So you can see at this point that there's about a pipe thickness protruding from the top. Obviously it's that I'm going to compress. So I now put this on top, and then the pointed bit goes inside the swaging die, and as you squeeze it down, that's how you get the first flare. So as I twist this in place, this is why it needs to be completely perpendicular to the length of the pipe. So it's quite hard work, this. Ugh. Hard on the hands, but I can feel the pipe moving. Right, if I now undo this, you'll see the first part of the flare. So that's what's known as a single flare. So we've got one part of the flare done. To then finish it off, you then just use this on its own without the swaging die, and then the point of that gives you your second flare and makes for a nice finish. Okay, so you can see this has got a countersink in it, so that's what I want to use to get that second flare really nicely finished. Okay, one really nicely flared pipe, and of course what I've got to do at this stage is put one fixing on there, and then before I do this side, I've got to put the other end on as well, because it's now onto this end. Swaging die back on, repeat the process. Of course, if you don't want to hold it in your hand, you can easily clamp this in a vise, and that's what I'm doing this time round. Okay, you can see the first flare in there. So there we go, one double flare with the hole nicely centralised on the pipe, and that'll easily work with the new fitting behind it and tighten up nicely to give you a good, hopefully leak-free fixing. With this new link pipe ready to bend, it's worth just taking the old one, and you can really see that it's pretty easy stuff to manipulate by hand. But there are various tools that you can get as well. This here copes with 3 different pipe gauges. This is good for making smooth bend radius pipes. And this here is again, it only copes with small pipes, this one. This is the smallest. And what you do is you clamp the pipe in, and then you kind of roll your wrist, and that bends the pipe round. So this one's better for tighter corners like that. What you've really got to watch out for, though, is overbending the pipe or getting a kink, because that will obviously affect the displacement of the fluid and potentially be a safety issue. Because obviously what we want here is an even distribution of fluid to each caliper. So my first job on this side is to have a small amount of straight and then start the first bend. So I'm going to clamp it in here and then roll that around to try and get that first bend right. I'll be doing this next bit by hand just to try and mimic the same as I've done the other side. So it's a bit fiddly, but if you're patient and take your time, you can actually get this done. Of course, what you don't want to do is end up with that and the bends down here so that you can't get your fixing to where you actually need the joint to be. So at this stage, just hand tightening it to check is a good thing to do. And nice smooth radius around there. It's looking reasonably symmetrical. Just a little bit of adjustment to get this side in place and get that angle of the pipe in the bottom. Because what we don't want is when the car's driving along, for that kind of thing to be happening. Okay, that's good. So this pipe is about done now. Actually quite satisfying once you've got it done. So I can hand tighten those. That means that the pipe inside isn't really pushing at an awkward angle. A few adjustments, but yeah, quite pleased with that. Just nip these up with a 7/16 spanner. Don't want to get these too tight, because of course you've got the copper pipe in there, so you'll be compressing that to create the seal. Only a small thing this, but I'm reusing the T-piece that splits the brake pressure between both calipers. So that hole there is where it bolts onto the frame. Quick go in the degreaser, as new, ready to use again. I've had to cut this bolt down to be the right length to go through this T-piece and not protrude too far below the subframe. So I'm just going to get the right washers and everything in place so that that's ready to go back on. So I can now secure the T-piece in place onto the subframe here and get ready to replace, well, make and replace this and the other feed pipe that goes to the caliper. Okay, that's securely locked into place. I've now run the pipe from the T-piece all the way through and across. Obviously, I want to make sure that there isn't any chance of it rattling. And just to make that as secure as possible, I'm going to be using these pipe clips that go onto the fixings for the bottom plate on the subframe. So I can now fit the pipe clips using slightly longer fixings. The original ones just aren't quite long enough. So I've got this brake pipe ready to go between the piston here and the T-piece. So I need it to come around this corner here, round there, over the top, and in the bottom there. So quite a tricky little run. With this piston now connected up, I've blanked off this part of the T-piece with a bolt. My last job before getting onto the handbrakes that fit up here is this easy bleed system. So this is a short pipe that's going to go to the top of this piston. This one will go all the way up and across to there. And then there are cable ties in the pack that allow you to secure this flexible hose so it doesn't flap around. I've got these banjo bolts here, so there's a hole that goes through, and then that's where the fluid goes through. So you have a solid washer at the top, and then there's a crushable copper washer that goes between the banjo here and the caliper. I've left this loose at the bottom because I want to be able to orientate it in the right way and get this nicely coming through the gap, so it's not against the caliper and it's not against the frame. I'll hopefully get this hand started. Just test your dexterity, some of this. So the further down I can get it with my fingers, the better. Then with a 9/16 spanner, it's a question of getting in there and slowly working it round. Need to make sure that it's tightened down enough so that that seals properly, because the last thing I want to do is get this frame onto the car and then end up with a leak here. That would be really bad news. Okay, that's really quite tight now, nicely in the middle there. Now I can tighten up at the bottom. So I've now secured the remote bleeding pipes and cable tied them to the brake pipes here so that this is all nice and secure. All that's left for the main brakes is to fit the brake pads on this side and put the retaining clip in place. All that's remaining now is the handbrake mechanism. So that's done separately via a lever mechanism and these very small pads. So I need to assemble all this together so that I've got two handbrake mechanisms and then this central linkage that operates from the cable pulled by the handbrake lever itself. There are a few things to watch out for when reassembling the handbrake mechanism. This part of it isn't handed, these parts are. So what I'm going to start off is by offering up the brake pads and screwing them into place. So if I push that through there, then put the serrated washer on and the nuts. Okay, that's nice and tight. Now the other side. So I now offer this up to the caliper. You can see why the handbrake pads are this kind of almost triangular shape, because when you put the carriers in, they match the circular shape of the disc. I can then start to reassemble this lever and pawl assembly. So this pawl is designed in such a way so that as the handbrake pad wears, this rotates and moves down another tooth. Now this is a coil spring, and I've heard that they can be unreliable, but this is in a really nice condition. There's no corrosion in there and it's working fine. As a precaution, I did buy a modern replacement, which is simply a bent piece of spring steel to the right dimensions. So having inspected them, to be honest, I'm actually going to reuse the original one because I think it looks like a more quality part overall. So to reassemble this, I've got the grease at the ready. I'm going to grease the back of this part of the pawl assembly because, of course, I want that to be sliding up and down nice and freely. I want to get some grease in there with the spring as well to help protect it from any moisture ingress and general wear and tear. That's held in place on these two pins inside this lever arm. So I'm going to build it up from the bottom. There's a pin here with a hole in. So that goes through that small hole. Then there's a spring. So that goes there. And that will hook on to this pin. There we go. And the whole lot needs to slide up. So with those teeth, those need to go underneath that bit there. I need to stretch it. There's another pin that will hold it all in place. There we go. Okay, make sure there's a bit of grease there on the spring. There's quite a lot of grease when I took this apart, so it makes sense to get quite a lot back in there as well. Really, I don't want anything going wrong with this in service. You can see from the access in that subframe that there's really not very much. Now I want to get the pawl in. There's this little spring clip, so the pawl slots into there. Again, I'll get a fair bit of grease on the pawl itself. Run that around. And then that slots onto the hole that goes through the mechanism. I'm now going to clean my hands up for next steps. The next stage of the assembly is a little bit fiddly. So I've put the shielding plate on the inside here, and I need to feed this spring, which I've greased for its protection, through the hole, dangling it through, and hook it from the other side onto that bar that goes across. So I've joined the two together here. I can see the end of the spring. I need to pull it through and hook it over that bar there. There we go, pinging into place. So that's going to act there, and the pivot will go through the top. So now I can put this outer backing plate on. Loosely put that in place at this stage. There you go, just finger tight. And then a pin goes through the middle of it all. Most of the way through, there we go. And then a split pin goes through this side just to hold it all in place. Now that that's done, I can tighten this up. Now for this side, so what I need to do at this stage is get this long screw and feed that through and screw it into the pawl so I can feel the threads engaged already. So once I've got it to the right adjustment, there's a small hole here that goes in that channel there in the head of the bolt for a split pin to go through and lock at the other side. The final part of the assembly is this spring. So if you refer back to a previous episode, this helps pull the pads apart so that they don't stick on the brake disc. So this part of the piston carrier goes in that space there. I've had several goes at fitting this handbrake mechanism on this side, and it's really fiddly, and I've been working out why. There's a couple of reasons. This is the new spring, this is the old one. If I hold them side by side and align the holes, the prongs that actually go into the casting, it's slightly taller on the original one than this one. But that means that when I'm putting these holes up against the piston carrier here, it's always fighting when I try and push the bolt through. The second thing that I'm finding is that the new bolts here compared to the old ones, someone's actually chamfered the ends of these ones. So I've done the same here, because of course as you're pushing it through, if it's completely flat on the end, which it almost was, it makes it that much more difficult just to get things through. So I'll put the spring in first and lower it all through here. Then I'm putting in the tab washer. And this is where it starts to get tricky, because you've got several things you're trying to get the holes aligned and it's just all working against you. If you can get one side in, then you're in with a good chance. Okay, so that's one at least. Right, now I can take this one back out and concentrate on getting this side aligned. So I can now finally do up these bolts and then check the adjustment of the adjustment bolt that goes onto the pawl. So I've now adjusted this so that the pad clearance of the disc is good. So I can now put a split pin through here to lock that in place. I've checked that the brake pipe here has sufficient clearance from this lever arm to the caliper, and I can also now fold over these locking tabs to hold these in place. Spread it out each side. I now need to reassemble this mechanism to pull the handbrake levers by the same amount each side. I'm going to start off with this link here, drop that in on this side with that pin. I'll worry about a washer and a split pin later. Next I've got this central pin. I need to get this spring in. That's key to the mechanism working. Put these two through, that links the two through the middle. Turn it over. Could use one thick washer, in this case I'm using two. And then put the split pin in. I'll worry about spreading that later, but that holds that all together. Now I can offer this up to the frame. So these captive nuts are located in the frame so that you can actually get some adjustment left to right. Because it's essential that you get this set up in a way that it's pulling each lever by the same amount. Okay, it just gets hand tight at this point. It doesn't need to be fully tight. Right, I can now put these pins in. So this goes through here, drop that pin through. And that, you can already see where it's going. That goes in there. Right, the final part is to drop the spring into each of these holes. So of course that helps retract the whole mechanism. Just got that little tap down. Right, that's that in. So now that I've done a dry assembly, I'm going to take it apart again and grease each of these joints, because last thing we need, based on how inaccessible this is, we don't want anything seizing when the car's in use. And so here it is, one completely rebuilt IRS. Rebuilt differential, completely refurbished brakes, new bearings, new bushes, new springs, new dampers. Ready to go on the car. Of course, the car isn't yet ready for it. Please join me next time when I'll be stripping the body back, getting all of the chrome off, sending that off to be plated. I'll be removing the bonnet, taking the engine out for that to be rebuilt. There's an awful lot to do. Thanks very much.